So thank you for coming and learning about the C3. As I mentioned earlier, this has not been adopted by our California Department of Ed or legislature yet, but that doesn't mean we can't start using it, understanding it, embracing it, because I work with, at the county, I work with the 80 school districts in LA County, do a lot of training, and what's the ticket in? It's Common Core. And I think this is a good thing, because Common Core is saying, this isn't just the job of the English teachers anymore. It's not just the job of the math teachers. Everybody. So that's a double-edged sword for us. So the good news is we're finally being asked to the table. Hello. But the challenge for us is, what are you giving us to help us do that? And so this is the answer. Okay, so that's how we're framing the work we're doing. So we're going to dig in a little bit. I'm going to give you some time to look at it. I do a lot of training out of LACO on the Common Core and on this framework, and I'm going to point you to some places where you can find other resources. In my role at LACO and now in my role as NCSS, it's wonderful because I can leverage both and create things that work for us and for NCSS. So I'm trying to double dip, yeah. But it's helping. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit. We only have an hour, but I want to give you at least a glimpse of this and get you into the document. I will soon. Yes? What? Yeah. I really only brought this and this for each of you. What, you need the PowerPoint? Okay. No problem. Thank you, Mary. Okay, so what's the goal? You saw this earlier. Why do we teach what we teach? So they can answer the multiple choice, Jay Leno, what's the capital of Vermont? No, I don't think so. Unless you're from Vermont, and I've offended you, but it's really a bigger purpose, isn't it? We want kids to be prepared for the real world, not just for college and career, but to be engaged citizens in our American democracy. You know, you don't have to go very far to watch on the news and see what's happening all over the world. People dying to get the kinds of freedoms and rights and responsibilities that we have here. And yet how much is it taken for granted? We need to infuse in young people the value of this. People have died in our own country, right, to have these rights. Think about our history. Okay, so that's our primary goal. It's about civic engagement. The whole framing of the social studies is to promote civic engagement, help kids become active and responsible citizens. Teaching students to be able to act in these ways as citizens enhances preparation for college and career, which is interesting too, because a lot of the skills you do in civics, collaborative work, problem solving, reaching out, bringing stakeholders in, promoting policy, those are the same kinds of skills that are powerful for kids in college and career as well too, right? So, I mentioned earlier, I have to talk in here, so we have the webcasts. I have a couple different webcasts. I'm going to show you a few snippets. They're 1 hour long, so it'd be easy for me to press play and go out for a coffee, but I'm not going to do that to you. But I do want to show you some little clips. This one I want to show you is from Peter Levine. If you don't know Peter Levine, he is the national amazing guru of this out of Circle, the Center for Good Things. I can't remember the acronym right now, but he's out of Tufts University. He's the primary author of The Guardian of Democracy, you know that, the civic mission of schools. I want you to hear what he has to say, because he'll say it so much better about what we mean about civic engagement. Now this is part of a 1 hour, so you're going to see an intro question from me and then hopefully him, if this works. And I have no sound. In this joint broadcast from Tufts University in Massachusetts, Peter, you're considered by many across America to be the preeminent scholar of civic learning, and you've contributed so much to the field by conducting research, resources, establishing online venues for students and adults to dialogue about democratic practices and civic learning. So for all these reasons and so many more, you were chosen to be one of the writers of the civics portion of the C3 Framework for Social Studies State Standards, along with Dr. Mara Levinson from Harvard University and Cynthia Tyson from Ohio State University. Peter, can you share your thoughts? Why is the Mary Beth Tinker story and so many others like it so important for students to learn?
Michelle, your intro is way too nice, but I'm glad to be with you. The Mary Beth's story is a fantastic illustration of what we're trying to teach through the framework. First of all, it's a really important story because kids were involved. Kids were the plaintiffs in the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And of course, the issues in the case had to do with kids' rights to free expression in schools. And I think it's very important for kids to understand that the Constitution is still alive, that it's still being debated, that the issues are still contested, and that they both affect kids and that kids can make a difference in changing them.
Thank you, Peter. And as we mentioned, you were deeply involved in the development of the C3 framework. Can you tell us more specifically, how does the C3 framework help teachers teach these important civic stories to prepare students for effective citizenship?
Well, the C3 standards are fairly streamlined. They're not super long. There's actually not that many standards. And they aim for big, important, perennial, controversial, but central principles and ideas. And a lot of those ideas, or several of those ideas, come up in Mary Beth's story. Freedom of expression, the role of the Supreme Court and judicial review, and a bunch of other ideas. And because the C3 standards are going for big, important ideas and are not larded with thousands and thousands of extraneous or miscellaneous topics, a teacher using the C3 framework could really take the time to investigate Mary Beth's story, in its context with her narrative, and also with what happened afterwards, because the story didn't end with Tinker v. Des Moines. There have been other Supreme Court decisions since, and there have been other legislative actions since. For example, your state legislature, California, has actually been pretty positive about this stuff, and it's important for kids to understand that it's not just the court that makes decisions about how we govern, it's also a lot of other institutions. The other thing about the C3 is it ends with taking informed action as a key standard, and of course, Mary Beth took informed action. So it's an example, and it's something that kids can think about as they take action.
Thank you, Peter, for your insights and helping us understand the real purpose for the vision of the C3, which is to create active and engaged citizens.
Okay. So, let me go back to this now.
So the case he's talking about is Tinker versus Des Moines. You remember this? And Mary Beth Tinker is also on this webcast. You saw her very briefly. She tells her story on the webcast, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. So you can see why this is so framed around this. So the C3 is really framed around these 4 dimensions. We call it the inquiry arc. And it's about starting all social studies with an inquiry, all right, a question. We're used to looking at big ideas and essential questions and those kinds of things, but we're starting with what we call a compelling question. So we go into depth in that and give some examples of that. I'll come back to it. Dimension 2 then is, once you frame this question, let's dig into the content to find the answers. Let's dig into history, civics, economics, and geography. And of course, our other folks from the other humanities are saying, look at psychology, sociology, all of these. There's great content that we can access and need to go to be able to solve some of these and address these complex issues and questions. We then go to having kids evaluate sources, looking at multiple points of view. This is nothing new. We already are doing that, but it's framed in the context of addressing that initial question or inquiry. And the 4th dimension is, as he mentioned, being able to communicate that conclusion. We do that now, but here's the big lift, taking action on that. What do I do with that? You know, all the knowledge of history in the world is great to know, but if it doesn't inform our everyday lives, if we don't learn from that, if we don't move forward and address it in the reality, I have to ask, and your kids ask this all the time, why do we have to know this stuff? So that's a real compelling piece as well. All right, so let me give you some time to open the document. This is the full document, and like I said, you can download this for free off the NCSS socialstudies.org/C3. But I printed these hard copies out for you to take. So why don't I give you some time, open up to page 16, if you would. and this is kind of the intro. Take a few minutes to read 16 through 21 and start to get your head around a little bit on what this is about. You're going to see a lot of things similar to what you're already doing, but you might also see some ways in which it's stretching you. So we'll talk some more about that. Let me give you some time. And these are yours to keep, so you can keep these too. Take them with you. We're short frameworks. Is there anyone who hasn't took an extra one we can give to? You're okay to give it? Oh, here's an extra one. Okay, thank you. Let's talk a little bit. I'm going to run out of time, I see real easily. And already some of you are picking up some of this. A gentleman came and said this reminds him a lot of Avid approach. Where are you? Yeah. This young lady right here talked about how this sounds like History Day. Yeah? So tell me, what do you guys think about this? Is this similar? Is it new? Not so new? What's your reaction? Back here. Oh, wait a minute. We need people to come to the mic? Is that how this is working? Okay. She don't want to come to the mic. You say it, I'll repeat it. How's that? Okay.
I was going to add, it's also like process-based learning when you start with a driving question.
Very much like project-based learning, you start with a driving question. Here we call it a compelling question. Very same idea. Fantastic. What else does it remind you of? History Day, we heard. All right. Anything in here seem familiar to you and what you already are doing in some areas? What are those areas that you're already doing that looks very familiar?
My morning dispatch, or, just, I call it reflection. So the essential question launches my lesson every day.
You start with a compelling, essential question to get kids excited. Great. Don't you wish all classrooms and kids had that? That's what we're trying to move here. What else looks familiar to you? I saw another hand. NCSS conference presenter. Yes, I can't remember her name, but yeah.
The inquiry model, we use the primary sources, and then for what they're communicating.
Yes.
Using, my kids have to do mastery projects, so like how are you going to display your learning in present, use, cast, when you're going to do that? Show us what you know.
Different ways of communicating conclusions, using primary sources, doing multiple perspectives. We all are doing that, right? Okay, yes, one more.
This reminds me of the dilemma-driven approach that SAG is taking, Stanford History Education Group.
Stanford History Education Group, you know them? The Sam Weinberg work, fantastic. This is a perfect fit. This is the kind of thing that will institutionalize that work. Yes. In fact, one of the leaders of that group is getting a research award at the conference in Boston, so they're being recognized, a big part of that. Okay, do you see similarities to this to what we're trying to get to with Common Core? Now put your Common Core hat on. What does Common Core call for kids and teachers to be thinking about? What's the big... Evidence-based. Reading informational text, reading nonfiction, giving our writing, opinion writing, persuasive writing, and finding evidence in text. Perfect match. So you can see why there was all this intentionality to make that clear in this document, the connections to Common Core. I have to tell you, when we were sitting down and putting this together, huge debate on whether we should be doing that or not. Okay, and that conversation was going on 3 years ago, when all the hubbub over Common Core hadn't really risen to the surface, because we know that some states are really fully embracing Common Core, like California. But it's interesting, if you watch the national news, a lot of states refuse to call it Common Core. They're morphing it into something different. They're trying to unadopt it. So there's a lot of political issues running around that. So the decision to articulate that in here was a big one. And I'm glad we did. Okay, let's talk about what we think about instructional shifts And in the next fall edition of the Social Ed Journal for NCSS that's coming in, I've submitted an article to talk about instructional shifts. Because you're hearing that term with Common Core, right? So what are the shifts for this? And the way I like to think of it is, what's a shift for somebody may not be a shift for someone else. So a lot of the things you just talked about that you're already doing may not be a shift, but for some it might. So we got to be kind of circumspect and sensitive to when we toss that term around. And so what you're going to see now, so we're at this stage at NCSS, this is out. And everybody, a lot of groups are out there trying to push it and move it and align it and create things. And we don't have control over a lot of that, but that's okay, because people are going to take it and interpret it different ways. There's a lot of people who are calling shifts that are different than our shifts, so that's just a note for you to think about. But some of the things to think about are these areas right here. First of all, inquiry is at the center of this C3 approach to social studies. Now, if you're already working in that way, then it's not a shift. But for a lot of folks, it is. They go through the textbook. Okay, we're going to learn the causes and effects of the Civil War. I don't know if that's an inquiry, a compelling reason to want to learn that. Can you shift that to make it a compelling question? Can you speak to the intersection of the ideas and learners, and what's going to really spark excitement for young people to start learning whatever the topic is you've got to teach them, like you do when you start your lessons each day. So what's a compelling question? What makes a question compelling for students? It should focus on something real that they can connect to that's important to them. It should spark curiosity. It needs still to be intellectually meaty, as they say, because it's not about soft stuff, even though we have a lot of content and skills. So for example, traditionally, and I know when I taught this, is, all right, boys and girls, we're going to learn about the causes of the events that led to the American Revolution. And they're not smiling. I don't know why. I'm so excited about this, and they're not excited at all. But I wish I'd had this when I was in the classroom, because I would then say, was the American Revolution revolutionary? See, that's a little more exciting, isn't it? Kids like revolution, right? They like to fight back and think of reasons like that. Civil rights movement, was it a success? Think about middle school and high school kids getting their heads around that. They've studied the civil rights movement. It's this thing that happened a long time ago, but has everything been materialized and realized today? Get them to start thinking about that. For young kids, why do we need rules? First week of school, it's all about let's create rules for the classroom, right? Well, let's ask the kids to start with, well, what are rules? Why do we need them? At the LACO site, we have some close reading vignettes with Rebecca, who you saw earlier, and she does a lesson, a close reading on the First Amendment. And one of the pair shares you can see on the video is asking kids, why do we need rules? And this is where it hits home. So here's these 10-year-olds saying, well, I'm glad there are, because otherwise my brother, he would just be beating up on me all the time, and thank God Mom has a rule that she can't do that. I mean, so that's where kids sit. So that's the first one. Then you can build in some supporting questions to get to those big ideas. That's the second part of this dimension 1 on compelling and supporting questions. So in the trainings we do at LACO, we take our lessons that we normally do and think about entering into them by establishing a compelling kind of question. For some, that's kind of a shift. Okay. The second shift is, and this may not be a shift, is maintaining that disciplinary integrity. So we had a lot of conversation about this when we put this together, because social studies gets criticized often for being a soft subject, but it couldn't be anything further from the truth. There is great content, and it's important to maintain the integrity of that content for each of these areas. And when you dig into dimension 2 in here, you'll see standards but not standards. So this was hard too. I don't know if any of you remember, were alive or read about, when we tried to do national history standards back in the 80s. Mary remembers all this, and the wars that broke out. Even what do we call the Civil War, for heaven's sakes, right? The War of Northern Aggression, as it's called in some states. So we don't want to get caught up in that. because what's important to some states, not so much, interpreted different in others. But we did feel the importance of maintaining some of that content integrity that you see in Dimension 2, which begins on page 29. Okay? So when you have a chance, take a look at that, and you can see what we're talking about. And you can see how you can even stretch our own California standards to get to these higher order. What I like about this, too, is that we've given equal time to the 4 main disciplines. So geography isn't just the add-on that you do. Here's a map, kids. There, I've done geography, right? But it's really intentionally built in. Mary's from the History Project. She could speak to this. History Geography Project. Thank you, Mary. Okay. And interdisciplinary connections, too. Thank you. Between those areas. So here's an interesting thing. I mean, think about it. How can you talk about the Civil War without talking about the economic implications, right? The geographic implications, of course, the history, but also the civics piece. Because sometimes the way our standards are, we're narrow focus on the history and not so intentional on blending all of that together. Any period of history is going to be focused on that, too. So thank you, Scott, for pointing that out. And you'll see the connections to Common Core. All right, the third shift for some is this taking informed action and applying in the real world, okay? A lot of folks are very frustrated because they don't have time to do that. I mean, I have teachers who say, oh, I really want to do this, I want to spend a lot of time on this topic, but I'm sorry, Michelle, I'm never going to get to Korea by April 10th, which is my pacing guide says I have to be, right? You're laughing because you know what I'm talking about. So how can we go deep? How can I get permission? A lot of teachers are having conversations right now with their principals and district. Give me some time, loosen up that pacing guide, allow me to go slow and then fast, slow and fast. So that's a site decision too. If you've got good leadership, sometimes that's happening. So taking that informed action is big, and that'll get to the civic piece. So was the civil rights movement a success? We have Bellflower High School, one of our democracy schools, who's did, Brian's here, he could tell you all about it. That was the frame of their whole town set hall. What was the name of the activity? Civic Fair? What'd they call it, Ryan?
Yes, they call it a civics fair.
Civics Fair, and that was for the whole school, and each group of kids looked at different pockets of that. Has the civil rights movement been realized for immigrant students, for Latinos, for students with disabilities, for LGBT, for all of these groups? And they did the research, they looked at both points of view, they came up with a conclusion, and they presented it. It's fantastic. And they presented that to the whole school under Ryan's leadership. That school is going to do that approach with different topics. Every history teacher in the school is going to do that because their principal has it as an important piece. Isn't that fabulous? Okay. The whole idea that this inquiry arc is a frame for teaching and learning. I think one of the exciting things we love about social studies is it's not black and white, is it? It often prompts more questions than answers. We love to muck around in the gray, don't we? This isn't like math class. This is like, let's dig in, let's ask more, let's delve more, well, what do you think? Well, what do you think? Well, what do you think? Don't kids just get so frustrated with you when you do that? But it's fun because it gets them to do that. So understanding and applying that. So here's where we're at. These are 4 areas that for a lot of people may represent shifts, and for others, maybe not. So let's move on. So I wanted to tell you again about this webcast. Now there's 2 webcasts on the LACO website. One is a 1-hour overview of C3, which is kind of going over the kinds of things I'm going over. It features the main architects, Kathy Swan, S.G. Grant, John Lee, and some others. But the second one we just finished is around the implications for civic learning. And I'm not going to play a lot of this, but there's Mary Beth Tinker. And we start with about 20 minutes with her. And the day before, she had spoken at our CCSS conference at LAX Gateway. So let me tell you a little bit about her story, and you can show this to your kids. It's fantastic. So maybe you remember this photo. Okay? Do you remember this? Vietnam War, right? Kids come to school to protest, and they come to school with the black armbands. You remember this story? Okay? And as soon as this is Mary Beth and her brother John, and they came to school wearing the black armbands, that's them, and what did the principal say when they got there? Take it off, go home. You're going to be suspended from school. And she tells her story so beautifully. So she says, well, I was a good girl. I wasn't a rebel rouser. So the principal said, take it off. I took it home, took it off, and I went home. She didn't realize what she'd started. Long story short, the ACLU got a hold of that, and they felt that these students' rights, First Amendment rights, were violated. They should have a right to freedom of expression as long as they're not disrupting school. And this thing went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in the kids' favor. So this became a huge landmark decision of which all other cases around student expression have been weighed against. The Supreme Court has come out on both sides of this issue, depending on the issue, but it's a fabulous story. And there she is at the museum. If you ever get to Washington, D.C., go to the museum. They have a whole display on her telling her story. But we had her at CCSS. It was fantastic. And while she was in town, I grabbed her and put her on the studio so I could capture her story, okay? So that's why we think it's important to tell the history lessons here. This is an important history story, but think of the implications for today. And that's where the C3 wants to bring this forward. So this has happened then. What can we and should we be doing now? And what are the things we have to be careful we don't do? Right? So there's freedom of expression and there's freedom of expression. So if you can dig down deep for kids and what's appropriate and what's not, what's going to get you in real trouble and what you can do to really move things forward, that's good civic learning. That's what the C3 is about. So let's go forward here. And I want you to open up particularly the civics portion. So if you open to page 30 to 34, this is part of Dimension 2. And this is, I want you to just, because we're focusing on civics today, you'll read the other sections. When you come to the history conference, you'll read the history section. But I want you to read the civics piece because we're representing that. And take a minute to look through here, and then you'll see it's the blue sections, 3 sections. And I know you're going to go straight to your grade level, because of course that's what I would do. Take a few minutes and think about how your lessons and curriculum can be stretched a little bit to get to some of these. Now, we don't call them standards, we call them civic indicators. While you're looking at that, let me show you this next video clip, because Marshall Crotty is the president of Constitutional Rights Foundation. I know a lot of you know their work. It's fantastic. And he was part of the task force. So there was this task force that worked on this. Remember, I don't know if you remember, it had National Geographic, all the civics folks, the history folks, the econ folks, all in the same room. Amazing. Think of your worst department meeting gone bad. I mean, geez. Such different folks in there and just all getting along and making this work. It was phenomenal. Anyway, I have him on this broadcast too because he was a big shaper of the C3. He and Peter Levine, particularly, Peter Levine was one of the authors of this civics portion right here. He's a very nice man, very modest. But Marshall in this clip is going to talk about how the whole inquiry arc is a civic learning arc. So listen to what he says. The work. And so thank you. Let's go a little deeper though and talk specifically about civic learning. As a member of the task force, Marshall, what do you see as the power of the framework to be able to teach those important civic lessons such as Tinker versus Des Moines?
Well, in your overview, we talk about the inquiry arc rather. I think it's a civic learning arc. We start off with the first dimension, and we look at asking effective questions, inquiry. What are the questions that citizens need to know about? Then we move to the 4 disciplines, and it's pretty key that for most issues, or for many issues, you have to have a pretty sound grounding in those disciplines. I was thinking this morning about the Crimea incursion by Russia. You have to know something about the history of how Russia has behaved towards that area of the world. You have to look at the geography of why Crimea is so important to the Russians because of the necessary fair weather port. You've got to understand something about the Cold War and how the dynamics between the United States and Europe and Russia took place. You really have to understand something about American foreign policy establishment and how we make foreign policy. So all of those things have to come together before you even understand what the issues are. And then as you go through, once you come to those and you have the question and you have background about it, there's also the question of how do you draw a conclusion? What should happen? And I think that that's why Dimension 3 is so important. Evidence-based decision-making, conclusions based on evidence. Yeah. And then finally, once you have that, you have to be able to communicate those things as either an advocate or as an explainer to others about your position, and it's necessary for you to take action. It might be voting, it might be, making presentations on the issue, or even talking to friends and collaborators. But the point is, you should be able to take action based on what you've learned. So in a sense, the 4 dimensions take you through that process and give a student and a young learner a deep background for participating in civic life.
Yeah. I like how you called it a civic learning arc. That's a great term for it.
Okay, so that's a great way of framing all of that. Let me show you this next portion. So here he's going to talk about how
to make sure that students get an education more deeply than just broadly.
Support civic learning.
Exactly. Okay, let's return again to our discussion of Dimension 4. Peter, Marshall, you both brought it up. I think we agree it's probably the most powerful piece of the C3 because it really changes the purpose and dynamic for social studies to prepare them to become students to become engaged citizens. So let's dig a little more. Peter and Marshall, your thoughts. How does Dimension 4, in your mind, support civic learning in powerful ways?
Well, the purpose of education for democracy is to educate young people to actually to take informed action. Citizens are supposed to act. That's what makes a democracy work. And so we've always, I think, been trying to prepare young people to be active and informed citizens. And in fact, data shows that a lot of teachers already do experience an action in their social studies classrooms. It's nothing completely new. And most state standards have something to say about action somewhere in the standards today. But the C3 definitely makes a bigger, more central purpose out of action, gives them greater weight, makes them the culmination of what we're trying to educate, the kind of test of whether we've really educated in a useful way. Kids should be able to take informed action. When people are cautious or concerned about the taking informed action standard, I think it's often because they imagine very narrow types of, or very particular types of action. So they think either of something very political, like, for example, wearing armbands in school and going to the Supreme Court, mayor death, or service learning. And I'm actually in favor of both those two things in the right place, and we've done a lot of work with service learning over the years. But there are only 2 examples, and there's lots of other ways that you can take informed action, including by raising awareness about an issue in the classroom, by doing research projects together, by creating media, by creating online news. So there's lots of things you can do, and different forms of action will be appropriate for different schools, different kids, different grade levels. So there's sort of not one kind of action, but all kids should take informed action.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay, so that gives you a sense. So leading us now into this 4th dimension,
Okay, so let's take a minute and turn to page 62, if you would. Jump to dimension 4. I want to give you a little bit of time to think about that dimension 4. Starting on page 62, what do we mean by taking informed action, and what would be the indicators of success for kids at different grade levels? Take a minute and just read that and think about some of your own work and how you might want to stretch a little bit to get to this very important piece at the end. So I know I haven't given you a lot of time, but take a minute, turn to someone next to you, and just sort of think through some thoughts you might have on C3 and how it might stretch some of the teaching you're doing currently with your students as we start the new school year. Obviously, you may not approach this with everything you're doing all this year, but to play around a little. What are some ideas that are bubbling around? Talk to someone next to you to help process that. Share your thoughts with each other. Okay, I'm sorry. So, we're going to run out of time. Are you starting to get some ideas? Obviously, this isn't enough time to really do a deep dive, but I hope you can start to think about this in morphing some of your work. If you start with essential questions, look at them again and see if you can make them really compelling. Are they compelling and exciting for kids? Are you learning about history in the past? Is there a way to connect it to today in more intentional ways and get kids to address some of these issues that are raised in their learning of history? So we don't have a lot of time, but keep NCSS in mind. Like I said, we just got a big grant from the Great Gates Foundation to bring teachers together through online platforms to dig in and explore and do some work. If you're interested in joining that, please let me know. We want to be able to capture some of this and create a huge clearinghouse for the nation. So that's where we're at now. The document is out. We want to put legs on it, and the way to do it is with you and your work. This lovely lady here is working on the curriculum for, what's the name of your group? Learn from Life Concepts Charter. She's writing social studies curriculum. She wants to align it to C3. That'd be great too. So let me wrap up real quick and then we'll take some questions. Here's where you can find that webcast of the snippets that I just showed you, and I gave really short shrift to Mary Beth, but show that to your kids. It's fantastic. It's about 20 minutes. She tells her story. This is the introductory one. You can also find it at LACO with Susan Griffin, who's the NCSS Executive Director. When you go to this socialstudies.org/C3, this is what the page looks like. And here, see, you can download, see this? You can download this whole document here, share it as a PDF, put it out, share it at will. Those other videos, that 5-minute one you saw of Rebecca in the keynote session, that's up there now. Use that in your trainings and your department meetings to help us spread the word, and you can go there too. All right, so any questions or thoughts before we wrap up here? Yeah. Actually, do you mind coming up here? Okay. I don't know if the mic is working though. Is it working now? Oh, cool. Okay. There you go.
One thing that I found very...
Turn toward the camera. There you go.
One thing that I found very useful working with teachers now and with students is reminding them that the inquiry process that we're discussing here, that you have brought to us, so thank you, is essential to how we want to advance content as a PhD student or a EDD student or a master's thesis. It's the same process of inquiry that really, in the sciences, it's sometimes called the scientific method, right?
Yes.
That really shapes our civilization. And that has been something that is not just been exclusive to our society, it's throughout human history. Any sort of advances are because of simple questioning and inquiry. And so I think students need to know that that's something that adults live, that's the world that adults live in, and that we need them to sort of still carry that and to start generating those questions. That's our power plant, I guess you could say, Bart.
I'm so glad we have you on camera. That was fantastic. Beautifully said. Thank you. Well, this is the message we're trying to do. We're doing it with Common Core. Science is doing it. This is our way to do it, to really prepare kids for the future. Any other last-minute questions or comments? Well, I'll be around. I have to leave early today for a flight, but I'll be around through lunch. I have cards from NCSS. If you're interested in doing more of this work, Scott Petrie, I want to talk to you. Come see me, because we are now in a place where we want 1,000 flowers to bloom around C3. Okay? So thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you.